The Air Rescue Service is a disestablished organization in the United States Air Force. Previously a subcommand of the Military Air Transport Service, a USAF Major Command, ARS was redesignated as the Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Service on 1 January 1966 when MAT was redesignated as the Military Airlift Command. As ARRS, it retained the same subcommand status with MAC. The Air Rescue Service was initially established in 1946 under the Air Transport Command, just prior to the U.S. Air Force's designation as a separate service in 1947, and it continued to serve the U.S. Air Force proudly as both ARS and ARRS during the Korean War and Vietnam War, as well as during the Cold War. Rescue's worth was proven time and again. 996 combat saves in Korea and 2,780 in Southeast Asia. The crews, both fixed-wing and helicopter, had but one motto: "These things we do that others may live." ARRS returned to its former name of ARS in 1989 and was disestablished in 1993. Following the disestablishment of Military Airlift Command and the dispersal of legacy USAF search and rescue forces among the Air Combat Command, the Air Force Special Operations Command, United States Air Forces in Europe and Pacific Air Forces, to include those Air Force Reserve Command and Air National Guard rescue units operationally gained by these MAJCOMs. The current structure and strength of search and rescue in today's U.S. Air Force is focused primarily on combat search and rescue and personnel recovery and is greatly reduced from the Air Rescue Force structure that served from 1946 through the end of the Vietnam era. Origins. There is always a first. In the case of the helicopter, the mainstay of the post-World War II USAF rescue structure, it was Lieutenant Carter Harmon who made the first U.S. Army Air Force's helicopter rescue in Burma behind Japanese lines on 25-26 April 1944. First Air Commando Sergeant Pilot Ed Murphy Ladovskak had crash-landed his L-1 aircraft with 3 wounded British soldiers on board. Taxing his Year 4 helicopter to its performance limits, Harmon made 4 flights to the site, making the final hasty liftoff just as shouting soldiers burst from the jungle. He learned later the soldiers were not Japanese, but an Allied land rescue party. In March 1946, the Air Rescue Service was established under the Air Transport Command to provide rescue coverage for the continental United States. By 1949, ARS aircraft covered all the world's transport routes. Korea and the Cold War. During the Korean War, the increased use of helicopters on rescue missions became a dominant factor in saving lives. By the time of the Korean Armistice, ARS crews were credited with the rescue of 9,898 United Nations personnel, of which 996 were combat saves. After the Korean War, the USAF Air Rescue Service resumed worldwide operations for rescue coverage, and ARS squadrons flew hundreds of humanitarian relief and rescue missions, primarily utilizing the Hu-16 Albatross fixed-wing amphibious aircraft and the UH-19 and HH-19 versions of the H-19 Chickasaw helicopter. In 1954, ARS relocated its headquarters to Orlando Air Force Base, Florida. The Hu-16, which began Pacific service during Korean and Vietnam conflicts, was returned to the continental United States in 1968. After 18 years of active use. In the late 1950s, the H-43 Husky helicopter entered the USAF inventory for use on or in the immediate vicinity of Air Force bases and air bases, followed by the CH-3E Sea King, HH-3E Jolly Green Giant helicopter and the HC-130 Hercules, a modified version of the C-130 Hercules tactical airlift aircraft. In the mid-1960s, On 1 January 1966, concurrent with the redesignation of the Military Air Transport Service as the Military Airlift Command, the Air Rescue Service was redesignated as the Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Service to reflect its additional role of worldwide rescue and recovery support for manned U.S. space flights conducted by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Vietnam War. The Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Service peacetime force was not equipped, trained, or structured to meet the demands of war in Southeast Asia in the early 1960s. As lessons were learned, the service's rescue capability continued to increase. During the Vietnam War, ARRS crews would save 4,120 people, with 2,780 of them in combat situations. At the outset of the Vietnam War, the primary rescue helicopter in the USAF inventory was the HH-43B Husky, manufactured by Kaman Aircraft. A firefighting and enhanced crash rescue capability was added by Kaman as an incentive for selection of the HH-43 by USAF acquisition officials. But the HH-43 was slow, short-ranged and unarmed, having been procured primarily for the local base recovery mission at Air Force bases in the United States and at other U.S. air bases overseas. The LBR concept also included a fire suppression role, with an external AFFF foam bottle, and firefighters as part of the flight crew. During June 1961, the HH-43 helicopters, crews, and support personnel of the various major commands were reassigned from their respective home bases and host wings to the Air Rescue Service in an attempt to unify their command structure. Standardized training and mission concepts were also implemented. As the Vietnam War escalated, HH-43 rescue detachments from bases in the continental United States were deployed to air bases in Vietnam and elsewhere in Southeast Asia with the new nickname and call sign of Pedro. The HH-43B's combat radius of only 75 miles was increased with added fuel drums strapped in the cabin. The HH-43B was eventually replaced with the armored HH-43F model for use in an area crew recovery mission role. The HH-43F also possessing additional internal fuel tanks for extended range. The HH-43F units were staffed with USAF pararescue personnel as part of the combat recovery team, and throughout the war, both HH-43B and HH-43F helicopters flew deep into North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. HH-43s accounted for more lives saved than any other rescue helicopter in the Vietnam War. In July 1965, ARS received its first CH-3C, an aircraft considered an adequate aircrew rescue vehicle. The HH-3E, Jolly Green Giant, and subsequent HH-53B/C, Super Jolly Green Giant, helicopters were manufactured by Sikorsky Aircraft Corp. Airborne command control of rescue operations was provided in December 1965 with the introduction of the modified Lockheed HC-130H Crown Airborne Controller. With the introduction of the HC-130PN, an air-refuelable HH-3E in June 1967, and the delivery of the air-refuelable HH-53B later that year, the now renamed Military Airlift Command and ARRS considered that they finally had the right force structure for combat rescue operations in Vietnam. Other aircraft that were on the rescue mission team included the low and slow-flying forward air controllers of the Tactical Air Command, call sign NAIL, a frequent rescue force component flying the O-1E Bird Dog, and later the O-2A Skymaster. NAIL would initially serve as the on-scene commander during a rescue operation until the arrival of USAF HC-130 Hercules aircraft utilizing the call sign of King, augmented by USAF A-1 Skyrider aircraft utilizing the call sign of Sandy. The Nail aircraft helped locate the downed crewman or crewmen, marking their location with smoke for the Sandys, and pickup helicopter utilizing the call sign of Pedro or Jolly, and directing close air support against enemy ground troops. In 1968, concurrent with the turnover of Orlando AFB to the U.S. Navy and redesignation as Naval Training Center Orlando, ARRS stateside headquarters relocated to Scott AFB, Illinois and embedded in MAC headquarters. In 1970, TAC-operated OV-10 Bronco aircraft began working with search and rescue forces, replacing the slower unarmed O-1 Bird Dogs and O-2 Skymasters as FAC aircraft. OV-10s equipped with pave nail night observation equipment could locate survivors at night or in bad weather and help development of rescue operations, relying more on advanced technology than merely courage, firepower and tactics. One Department of Defense report said that 1 Air Force search and rescue crewman and 2 aircraft were lost for every 9.2 recoveries in Vietnam, while the Navy lost a crewman for every 1.8 recoveries. ARRS had begun to build its reputation as the world's finest combat rescue force. However, the ARRS continued to be plagued by its own short-sightedness, even as new tactics and doctrine for combined rescue operations were developed. As late as October 1970, Colonel Frederick V. Solar, commander of the 3D Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Group, would say, "Our development has been a history of relearning lessons already learned by someone else, but who unfortunately could not or did not document it for others to profit by. This lack of documentation and the inability to integrate an institutional memory among ARRS forces would detrimentally affect combat search and rescue units well into the 1980s. Consequently, the CSAR mission became subordinate to daily support and auxiliary mission roles. If one lesson could be drawn from the Vietnam War, it was that an effective CSAR force was needed. Unfortunately, the institutional Air Force failed to learn this lesson well, and ARRS assets experienced the same neglect and lack of funding which plagued its ARS predecessor, from Vietnam to Desert Storm. In addition to overseas taskings, stateside taskings for ARRS also continued. In addition to ARRS aircraft, these AFRCCs also coordinated the use of Civil Air Patrol volunteers and their CAP aircraft and ground support units in their role as the civilian USAF auxiliary, primarily in searches for missing U.S. civilian general aviation aircraft in the United States, leaving stateside ARRS aircraft and units to concentrate on training, stateside military aircraft mishaps, NASA support, or complex SAR or disaster evolutions that were outside the capability of the air and ground assets of local civilian authorities or the CAP. In May 1974, the Air Force consolidated the 3 centers into one facility at Scott Air Force Base, Illinois. This single-site Air Force Rescue Coordination Center allowed co-location with headquarters, Military Airlift Command, provided better coordination of activities, improved communications and economy of operations, and standardized procedures. The newly formed AFRCC also permitted operations with fewer people while creating a more experienced staff. The withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from the Vietnam War was reminiscent of the massive drawdown of CSAR assets that occurred following the Korean War. After Vietnam, a few notable rescue operations took place, such as the deployment of ARRS helicopters aboard the US Saipan in June and August 1979 in support of a possible emergency evacuation of U.S. personnel in Nicaragua following the Communist Sandinista takeover. However, such missions occurred infrequently. As 1976 began, the ARRS had its headquarters and staff at Scott AFB, Illinois, and commanded 3 wings and numerous separate squadrons, detachments, and operating locations. Its subordinate wings were the 39th Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Wing, the 41st Rescue and Weather Reconnaissance Wing, and the 1550th Aircrew Training and Test Wing. Ironically, a classic contingency rescue operation proved to be the death knell of the ARRS, and, even more ironically, no ARRS helicopter units participated in the operation. The aborted mission to rescue the American embassy hostages in Tehran, Iran in the spring of 1980 dramatically demonstrated the need for close, realistic coordination and planning of joint service operations. While it is easy to speculate after the fact about what could have been done differently to make the mission successful, there was little doubt that the ARRS MH-53J paved low-3 aircraft was better suited to the operation. However, modified U.S. Navy RH-53D Sea Stallion minesweeping aircraft with U.S. Marine Corps flight crews were used instead. In multiple analyses of the aborted rescue attempt, 2 possible reasons for the use of the RH-53D have been postulated. Either the PAVLO system was not yet ready for this type of mission because it had just finished lengthy operational testing, or the RH-53D was used to placate the U.S. Marine Corps so they could participate with an aircraft that more closely approximated their own USMC CH-53D Sea Stallions. Certainly, one must concede that PAVLO aircrews, who were trained in the CSAR arena and routinely relied on HC-130s and MC-130s in their daily operations, were the logical choice for this type of mission and had a better aircraft with which to conduct it. Whatever the case, one point is clear: the entire operation was critically dependent on helicopters. As a result of the botched operation, the U.S. Air Force transferred all ARRS HH-53s to the 1st Special Operations Wing and what was then Tactical Air Command Control in May 1980. This transfer signaled the end of the ARRS's role in CSAR and precipitated the present distinctions between rescue drivers and special operators. Thus, the ARRS was left with an aging fleet of UH-1, HH-1 Iroquois or Huey, CH-3E and HH-3E Jolly Green Giant aircraft, augmented by HC-130N and HC-130P, and Hercules aircraft converted from C-130E airframes. In effect, the ARRS had no means to accomplish the CSAR mission in the threat environment of the 1980s and 1990s. Just as the Polish cavalry of 1939 was all-effective force within its own borders, but completely inadequate when confronted by German tanks, so too had the ARRS become an anachronism in a world where contingency and combat rescue operations relied on high-tech avionics and split-second timing. A 20-plus-year-old aircraft like the UH-1, with 1960s and 1970s avionics, was no longer useful. The latter allowed aircrews to operate under the cover of darkness, thus decreasing their vulnerability in low to medium threat environments. Although ARRS no longer had the proper mix of aircraft to conduct modern CSAR operations, it did at least have the foresight to continue to train crews in the CSAR environment, with emphasis on NVG operations. However, the inactivation of the HH-1 CSAR units in September 1987 closed a valuable pipeline of CSAR-trained aircrew members and limited the combat rescue role to a total of 4 overseas HH-3E Jolly Green Giant units and a stateside MH-60G Special Operations-capable Pave Hawk Squadron. Furthermore, Developments in the mid-1980s called into questions whether the MH-60G would continue to be affiliated with ARRS or with Military Airlift Command's newly formed 23rd Air Force for Special Operations following the divestiture of all USAF Special Operations Forces from Tactical Air Command. In August 1989, ARRS was reorganized and re-established as the Air Rescue Service at McClellan AFB, California, again as a subcommand to Military Airlift Command. However, following Operation Desert Storm in 1991, subsequent major USAF reorganizations resulted in the disestablishment of Military Airlift Command, the divestment of its C-130* tactical theater airlift assets to U.S. Air Forces in Europe, Pacific Air Forces and the newly created Air Combat Command, and the integration of its C-141 and C-5 strategic airlift assets with the KC-135 and KC-10 air refueling aircraft assets of the former Strategic Air Command in order to create the new Air Mobility Command. Note: ACC C-130 assets would later be transferred back to AMC, while USAF and PACAF C-130 assets remained under their respective control. Meanwhile, MAC's former 23rd Air Force became the nucleus for the new Air Force Special Operations Command. Subsequent base realignment and closure decisions in the 1990s also resulted in McClellan AF being marked for closure under the BRAC process. Shortly thereafter, in 1993, ARS was again disestablished, with most of its CSAR assets transferred to the newly established Air Combat Command that had been created by the merger of SAC bomber and strategic reconnaissance forces with the fighter and AWACS assets of the former Tactical Air Command. Concurrently, a smaller number of forward-based CSAR assets in Europe and the Pacific were transferred to USAF and PACAF, respectively. In 1993, concurrent with the disestablishment of MAC and the transfer of peacetime and combat search and rescue responsibilities to ACC, the AFRCC relocated from Scott AFB to Langley Air Force Base, Virginia. In October 2003, CSAR was temporarily realigned under AFSOC, resulting in what was thought would be a merger of regular Air Force Reserve Command and Air National Guard HC-130P and assets with MC-130P Combat Shadow assets and integration of HH-60G Pave Hawk assets with MH-53J, MPAVLO IV assets. However, this merger proved to be short-lived and the HC-130P and HH-60G CSAR assets were ultimately transferred back to ACC Claimant C in 2005. During the temporary assignment of the CSAR mission to AFSOC, the AFRCC remained at Langley AFB. However, on 1 March 2006, following the transfer of CSAR assets back to ACC, the AFRCC was realigned under 1st Air Force, Air Forces North, the Air Force Component Command to the newly established U.S. Northern Command and the ACC's numbered Air Force for the air defense fighter assets of the Air National Guard. As a result, the AFRCC relocated to Tyndall AFB, Florida, where it is now consolidated with the 601st Air Operations Center, giving it greater ability to leverage Air Force air and space capabilities that can be applied to search and rescue operations in the continental United States. The AFNORTH-01 also gained the responsibility for executing aerial search rescue and associated personnel recovery operations for civilian and military aircraft overland in the NORAD USNORTHCOM area of operations. This resulted in greater efficiencies and capabilities for military personnel and civilians alike.